My name is Sara Malik. I am 34 years old. I have been a flight attendant for 11 years. And at 34,000 feet on a Tuesday morning, I recognized a passenger on my flight from a missing persons alert I had read 3 hours earlier. She was sitting in seat 14C. The man who had reported her missing was sitting in 14B. Right beside her. I was standing at the galley curtain when I saw her face. I had the alert in my memory because I read every safety briefing and every crew notification before every flight without exception. It is a habit I developed in my first year and have never broken. Her name in the alert was Joanna Price, 31 years old, missing since Sunday, reported by her husband. The woman in 14C had the same face. The man in 14B had given his name at check-in as Richard Price. I turned back into the galley. I put both hands flat on the counter. I had 3 hours and 40 minutes until we landed in Edinburgh. I had no way to call the ground without him knowing, and the woman in 14C had not looked at me once. She was looking at the window, with the specific stillness of someone who has learned not to draw attention to herself. Let me tell you about the alert first. I read crew notifications at 6 a.m. before every flight, not because it is required. Because 11 years of this work has taught me that the information in those briefings matters. The missing persons alert had been included in that morning's security briefing, a Metropolitan Police notification distributed to transport hubs, standard procedure for recent high-risk missing persons cases. Joanna Price, 31 years old, 5'4", brown hair, a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Missing since Sunday evening, reported by her husband, Richard Price of Kensington, London. The alert had used the word high risk. In missing persons terminology, high risk means the investigating officers believe the missing person may be in danger. Not lost, not a voluntary disappearance, in danger. I had read it at 6 a.m. and filed it in the way I file all security information. Completely, precisely. Available for immediate retrieval. At 9:47 a.m., I stood at the galley curtain and retrieved it, because the woman in 14C had a small scar above her left eyebrow. The object at the center of the next 3 hours and 40 minutes was a drinks trolley. I know how that sounds, but the trolley was the only legitimate reason I had to approach row 14 repeatedly, to observe, to assess, to make eye contact with the woman in 14C without making eye contact with the man in 14B. I told my colleague Priya what I had seen. I did it in the galley with my back to the cabin and my voice very low. I told her in 2 sentences. She looked at me. She said, "Are you certain?" I said, "The scar." Left eyebrow, exact position. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to take the trolley to the front of the cabin. I need you to keep Richard Price's attention forward while I approach from the rear." She said, "And if he turns around?" I said, "Then we are just doing the drink service." She said, "And if she doesn't respond?" I said, "Then I need to know that too." Priya took the trolley to the front of the cabin. I walked to the rear. I began the service from row 28 forward. I reached row 14 at 10:23 a.m. Richard Price was watching Priya's trolley near the front. His body was angled slightly forward. He was a large man, well-dressed, the kind of compose that is practiced rather than natural. I said, "Good morning. Can I get you anything to drink?" He turned to look at me, directly, assessing, the kind of look that takes your measure in under 2 seconds. He said, "Water, please." I poured the water. I handed it to him. I held eye contact for exactly the right amount of time. Professional, unremarkable. Then I turned to 14C. I said, "And for you." She turned from the window. She looked at me, and I saw it, not the scar. I had already confirmed the scar. I saw her eyes. She was terrified, not anxious, not uncomfortable, terrified in the specific way of someone who has learned to make themselves invisible and is now being seen. I said, "Can I get you something to drink?" She said, "Just water, please." Her voice was completely flat. No inflection, no expression. The voice of someone who has been told exactly what to say. I poured the water. I handed it to her. and as I placed the cup in her hand, I held it for 1 second longer than necessary. I looked directly at her. I said very quietly, below the noise of the cabin, just 3 words, "I see you." Her fingers tightened on the cup. I went back to the galley. My hands were steady. 11 years. I said to Priya, "She is there. She is afraid. He does not know I recognized her." Priya said, "What do we do?" I said, "We have 3 hours and 19 minutes. We need to reach the ground team without him knowing, and we need to keep him calm for 3 hours and 19 minutes. Priya said, "The radio." I said, "He will hear it if I use it from the cabin. I need to speak to the captain directly." Priya said, "I'll cover the cabin." I went to the cockpit. Captain Morrison was 54 years old, 28 years of flying. She listened to me for 90 seconds without interrupting. Then she said, "You are certain?" I said, "The scar, the alert description." The way she looked at me. Morrison said, "And the husband?" I said, "He is watchful, controlled." He assessed me in under 2 seconds when I approached the row. Morrison said, "Okay." She said it in the specific way of someone who has just made a decision and is moving immediately to execution. She contacted Edinburgh ground control on a secure channel. She gave them the flight number, the seat numbers, the passenger name. Ground control confirmed receipt within 4 minutes. She said, "They will have a response team at the gate. Plain clothes, they will board as if they are routine ground staff." She said, "Sara, your job for the next 3 hours and 14 minutes is to make Richard Price believe this is the most ordinary flight he has ever been on." I said, "Understood." She said, and the woman, I said, "I will find a way to tell her." Morrison looked at me. She said carefully. I said, very carefully, "I want to pause here, because managing a cabin for 3 hours, knowing what I knew, and making sure nothing showed is the hardest professional thing I have ever done. If you have ever had to hold something enormous completely still while everything around you continued normally, drop a comment below and subscribe right now. Because what I found a way to tell Joanna Price and what happened when we landed in Edinburgh is the part that changes everything. The opportunity came at 11:45 a.m. Richard Price stood up to use the lavatory. He was gone for 4 minutes. I had been watching for this moment for 90 minutes. I walked to row 14 immediately. I crouched beside 14C at eye level. I said quietly, "My name is Sara. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. I recognized you from a missing persons alert this morning." She looked at me. I said, "There will be plainclothes officers at the gate when we land. They will board first. They will reach you before he can react. You do not need to do anything. You just need to stay exactly as you are." She said nothing. I said, "You don't have to speak. Just blink twice if you understand." She blinked twice. I said, "Is he aware of the alert?" She blinked once. "No." I said, "Are you hurt?" She blinked once, then twice, then once. I took that as the answer it was. I said, "We land in 1 hour and 52 minutes. You are safe on this aircraft. Nothing will happen to you here." I heard the lavatory door open. I stood up smoothly. I moved 2 rows forward to 12D. I leaned over and asked the passenger there if she would like a blanket. She said yes. I got a blanket. Richard Price walked back to his seat. He did not look at me. The next 1 hour and 52 minutes were the longest of my professional life. Priya and I ran the cabin normally. Drinks, snacks, headphone cables, the ordinary texture of a morning flight. I checked row 14 twice more from a distance. Richard Price watched films on the seatback screen. He appeared relaxed. Joanna Price sat completely still, looking at the window. Once at 12:34 p.m., she turned her head very slightly toward the aisle. She was looking for me. I was standing at the rear galley curtain. I caught her eye. I gave her one small nod. She turned back to the window. We landed in Edinburgh at 13:42 p.m. Morrison taxied to the gate slowly, deliberately, buying 90 additional seconds. The jetway connected. The cabin door opened. 4 people in ground crew uniforms boarded immediately. They were not ground crew. Two of them went directly to row 14. One stood at the front of the cabin, one stood at the rear. The two at row 14 reached Richard Price before he had fully stood from his seat. He understood immediately. I watched his face from the galley curtain. The composed practice calm dissolved in under 3 seconds. What replaced it was not anger. It was the expression of a man who had calculated every variable on this flight and had not calculated me. Joanna Price stood up. One of the officers placed a hand gently on her arm. She walked off the aircraft between two plainclothes officers. She did not look back. At the jetway door, she stopped for 1 second. She turned. She looked directly at me. She did not smile. She was not in a place where smiling was possible yet. But she looked at me, and I understood what that meant. Richard Price was arrested at the gate. The charges that followed took 3 months to be fully established. Coercive control, false imprisonment, assault causing grievous bodily harm, the specific harm that had not been visible on the aircraft, but that the medical team documented at the hospital in Edinburgh. He pleaded not guilty. The trial took 6 weeks. He was convicted on all 3 charges. He is serving 9 years. Joanna Price, I have not met her since the aircraft. This is correct. It needed to be that way. She had a process to go through that did not include the flight attendant who had recognized her from a briefing. She had people in support and the specific work of rebuilding that belongs entirely to her. But 3 months after the flight, I received a card. No return address. Postmarked Edinburgh. Inside was a single sentence in handwriting I did not recognize. It said, "I saw you see me." That was all. I put the card in my bag. I carry it on every flight. Here is what 34,000 feet and a drinks trolley taught me. Read the briefings, all of them, every time. Even the ones that seem like they will never be relevant to the specific flight you are about to operate. Because you do not know which flight will be the one where they matter. I read a missing persons alert at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. At 9:47 a.m. it mattered more than anything I had ever read. Pay attention, even when nothing seems to be happening, especially when nothing seems to be happening. The information you carry is not weight. It is the thing that makes you ready. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And subscribe. I am here every week with a new story. Same ending every time. She stayed calm. She stayed quiet. Then she won.